Lightbulb Moments with Amanda Harrison and friends.
So welcome to the Lightbulb Moments podcast. My name is Amanda Harrison, and this afternoon I will be speaking to Kelly Davies. Please excuse us if you hear knocking at the door or the school bell ring, as we're hosting this afternoon's podcast after school in my office. So let's get started. So welcome, Kelly. It's nice to speak to you today. Tell us something about yourself.
Hi, so my name's Kelly Davies. I am an assistant head teacher in a secondary school in North Wales. In terms of a bit of background, I went to the University of St Andrews to study psychology and maths with the aim of becoming a clinical psychologist, but my journey led me to teacher training. I secured my first post as an NQT in a school in the northwest of England before going on to be Key Stage 3 leader in my RQT year. I then decided to start a family, which brought me back to North Wales, and in my current school I secured the head of maths post before moving up to senior leadership level 5 years ago. I've got a few different areas of responsibility, but for the last 2 years my main focus has been teaching and learning across the school.
So do you use any of your psychology training in your normal school day?
Oh, lots, especially at the moment, post-pandemic.
I know you read a lot, Kelly, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you today. I know you work hard to keep up with research and evidence-informed practice. So if you're comfortable, I'd like to chat to you a little bit about your 5 biggest influences on your own teaching practice.
Okay, great.
Shall we start with the Teaching and Learning Toolkit from the EEF?
Okay, so the Teaching and Learning Toolkit is a great resource both for classroom teachers and for leaders who want to delve into the world of educational research but don't know where to start. The toolkit focuses on 30 different topics, as you will well know, and summarises them based on impact on attainment, strength of evidence, supporting this, and the cost. I like it because it doesn't make any sort of definitive claims, but instead it keeps you informed of effective education research, which is also live, so they update the resource, which means that you're kept up to date with the material. I found it really useful when reviewing school policies such as feedback, homework policies, talking about attainment, grouping. It really helps rationalise the choices that you make and provide some really good supporting evidence for conversations in SLT and for classroom teachers and of course other stakeholders.
So is it more suitable for established teachers in SLT or can it be accessible for NQTs as well?
No, I think it's accessible to anyone that wants to just start touching on some educational research. Obviously there's a wealth of material out there. So it's just a one-stop place where you can go and you've got all the up-to-date current information in one place. So no, I'd say it's accessible for all. Good
stuff, thank you. Your second book that you in particular you're a fan of, and I think most people would refer to, is Doug Lemov's Teach Like a Champion. I think it's a must-read for most people. Oh, now, obviously we don't have time to talk about all 63 techniques this afternoon. But what could you share with us, and what do you think are the top 3 that make a difference to your own practice?
Well, I do love Teach Like a Champion. It is always my go-to book for associate teachers and for NQTs, but it really is a great book for teachers across the range of experience and expertise. I think some techniques may seem a bit obvious for experienced teachers, but there's definitely something for everyone from the 63 techniques. And I think it really makes you appreciate the complexity of teaching and what an art good teaching really is. In terms of my top 3, I would say, hands down, the first one I would pick, no pun intended, is cold calling. So this is where there's ethos in the classroom where there's no hands up and anyone can be selected at any time. This really allows the teacher to personalise and target their questioning, but also builds a really good culture in the classroom where everyone has to contribute, so it's not just the more able learners that are dominating the classroom. It helps you sort of build that growth mindset and learn from mistakes. There's no such thing as a bad answer and everyone's learning together. And it's also really good to make sure you've got no passive learners in the classroom. So in terms of behaviour management, it means that there's no daydreamers, everyone has to be on task and listening at all times. So that's definitely my top one.
What would you say to people who argue against cold calling because they say that it for some children it's too intense?
Yeah, I think with anything you have to be, very careful with these things, that you can't just read about it and give it a go. There's a lot more to it. So it is all about building a certain culture in the classroom so that learners feel comfortable. And that will come with time. I think probably at first it could be a shock to some learners to be called upon, but it's all about the way that you teach the others to listen to each other, and the way that you praise any answer, even if it's not the right one at first, and encourage them to then double back and go back to them and say, great, now you understand it. So yeah, I think there's always some caution with these things, isn't there? So it takes time to build the right culture up.
Good, thank you. And your second one?
My second one would be plan for error. I think in the planning stage it's really important to think about what a learner might get wrong in a lesson or what might be misunderstood. So when I'm planning a new topic, I do often use friends from outside of education, or my husband or my children, to talk things through and to try and think about how my explanations might be sending some learners off with a misconception, or something that might be misunderstood. And I think this is great because it means that you're going into a lesson fully prepared for anything that might come up in that lesson, and it means that you can really think about scaffolding the learning and having the right resources ready. So that one's a good one.
And your third one?
The third one I've picked is affirmative check-in. So this is where the teacher puts in checkpoints in a lesson, where the learners can get feedback to see if they're correct and on track. And again, this is another tool for making sure that the teacher has control in the classroom, that they can anticipate the journey of the learning and stop and put any interventions in place and differentiate, and make sure that all the learners have got the correct level of challenge throughout the lesson. I would say also, I think it's a really good tool for self-regulation, to get independent learners. I think if they're getting that instant feedback and they know that they're being successful, it means that they're able to then make choices about their own learning and the direction that they go in. So I think that's really helpful. I would say one of the things that always strikes me, especially about being a maths teacher, quite often people will make comments, so I don't like maths, I've never liked maths. But I find that if the learners leave your lesson feeling successful, then they leave with a positive feeling about your subject. So I think giving them checkpoints and making them feel like they've been successful throughout the lesson is really important. So I use multiple choice questions a lot. Again, these have to be designed well to make sure that they consider any misconceptions and really challenge deep understanding. But Diagnostic Questions is a website that's a really excellent resource for this, and have got really well thought through multiple choice questions from across a range of subject areas. So I'd really recommend that website. And I really think it's an area that maybe departments should be putting a bit more focus into in terms of CPD time.
Great, thank you. I know you're also a fan of Dylan William, but what is it about his work that motivates you?
Well, I was really lucky to attend a conference with Dylan William in Cardiff a few years back. And as amazing as we all know that Dylan's work is, listening to him in person was hugely impactful. The thing I love so much about it is it's so easy to implement in terms of formative assessment in the classroom, but it can have such a huge impact. So that if you were trying to pick one sole thing to work on with a teacher, I'd say this is the one thing that can make such a huge difference to learning. I also think that formative assessment is a term that's often misused. I found that with associate teachers or newly qualified teachers, they really see the formative assessment as providing learners with an opportunity, like a checkpoint that we talked about with Doug's work. But it's actually about adapting the teaching after getting that feedback. So in Black and Williams' publication Inside the Black Box from '98, they described formative assessment as such assessment that only becomes formative when the evidence is actually used to adapt the teaching to meet the students' needs. And I think sometimes that can be missed. And this is where that affirmative check-in, again from Doug, really plays a role. So I think there's a lot of work there that can be done that can have a huge impact. The other thing that I use year on year from Dylan William is his article on 9 things every teacher should know. I read through those sort of 9 statements quite frequently, and I'm not going to read them out now, but I'd say go away and have a look at them, because I think they're really powerful as well.
Thank you. And so your final one, are there any other influences you think are important?
Well, the role of learning and memory is a fascinating and really powerful field of research to delve into as a teacher. As I mentioned, I study psychology at university, so I probably already had a natural curiosity about the inner working of the human brain. But seeing the role of cognitive psychology in teaching was a game changer for me, and something that I think should definitely be included in teacher training and in school CPD programmes. And in terms of the research behind memory and learning, I would highly recommend the work of Elizabeth and Robert Bjork. There is a really excellent podcast on Mr. Barton Maths podcasts, which talks about their work on memory. And it really builds on the work of Kirshner, Sweller and Clark, and their definition of learning as being a change in the long-term memory. So Dan Willingham refers to this in his book, and asks the question about how long does that change need to be, which I think is something that I've thought a lot about in terms of my role and having to monitor and evaluate teaching and learning in schools. Lesson observations has always been a big part of that, but over the past few years there's been a lot of sort of reflecting on the effectiveness of lesson observations as a way of observing progress. And can progress be seen in just 1 hour, or is this just performance? And I think the role of memory talks about how it's that change in long-term memory, so actually the learners have to be able to recall that knowledge over a long period of time to really show that they've understood it. So that's quite fascinating to me to look into, so that when we're making those judgments on teaching, that they're accurate. So retrieval practice is something that I feel really strongly about in terms of my own lessons, and I utilise a lot, and something I do tend to look out for when doing lesson observations, because obviously if a learner is able to recall something from a prior lesson, for me it gives a nod towards the learning rather than just the performance in a lesson.
Fabulous. Okay, so we're also really interested in leadership, Kelly, on Lightbulb Moments. So I wonder, can you talk to us about the qualities of good leadership you try to model, and who might have been your biggest leadership influences?
This is a difficult question, because there are so many amazing literature around leadership, but sport's always been a huge influence for me in terms of leadership. I took PE at A level, and it was one of my loves in secondary school, and I captained my high school hockey team and rounders team, so I feel that that's where my leadership experience began. I was recently reading an article from Applied Sports Psychology, written by 2 sports psychologists from Michigan State University, and they discussed the importance of the 3 C's of being a captain. And reading this, it really resonated with how I feel about leadership. So the 3 C's are caring, courageous and consistent. Caring, I think, it's one of those things that can get overlooked, but it's so important. We work with people after all, and young people who have lives outside of work. And I think that treating people in the right way gets the best out of people. Being courageous, I think, is also hugely important in education when, so many things change so frequently. I think we really have to stand firm as leaders and be sure about what we know works for our young people in our schools. And consistent is the third one, which, as leaders, we're role models. Like it or not, we are judged day in, day out, and expected to hold those high standards. And I think it's important for the people around us to be able to read our actions and know what to expect from us. So that really resonated with me. But, if I can mention a few other, important books or texts that I've read. So Legacy by James Kerr is a book that we've read as a senior leadership team. And we've discussed a lot and built our own vision around it. So, that's definitely one I'd recommend. Steve Radcliffe's Leadership Plain and Simple is another really good read, obviously drawn from the world of sport, as is Sir Clive Woodward's work, who talks a lot about sponges and rocks, and I think that's a really interesting read. But then tipping away back into the world of education, I also have to mention Mary Myatt's book. I recently read her book, Back on Track, and I'd say that's, a superb read, especially for sort of aspiring and new leaders. So I'd recommend that one.
Yeah, some really big hitters in there. I'd echo that with James Kerr. I think it's a good book for any leadership team to really look at what their own visions and values are, and to almost create their own mantra of how they do things. So yeah, I'd echo that one as well. Well, I've really enjoyed talking to you this afternoon, Kelly, and you've given us a lot of pointers there and places for us to go and have a look further at the things you talked about. I found that really valuable. So thank you for your time today.
You're welcome.
But before we let you go, it's been interesting listening to your thoughts on the top 5 educational resources and your influences from leadership. And so my final question for you today is, what advice would you give to aspiring female leaders who are in the early days of their own career journey?
Right, I think I would probably say there's probably 3 main things that I would say. The first one probably relates to maybe younger female leaders or mums. So I'd say don't ever feel guilty for choosing your career. I secured my first post in my current school as head of maths whilst I was on maternity leave. I began the job in September with a 10-month-old and a 2-year-old, both attending a brand new nursery. And working full-time with children is tough, but being a stay-at-home mum is also tough. But having goals and aspirations and a sense of drive and pride at work actually makes things easier, not harder. I felt it focused me to be more efficient with my time. I work smarter, not harder. It helps you, really relate to staff who have other commitments in their lives. And I'm enormously proud of the impact I've made over the last few years at work, but also at home. So, you can have it all.
That's lovely. Thank you, Kelly. If anybody wanted to follow you on Twitter, what's your Twitter handle?
So my Twitter handle is @KellyD_NWales.
Great, thank you. Hope you've enjoyed today's podcast, listeners. Tune in for the next one in a few weeks. Thank you. Bye.
Lightbulb Moments with Amanda Harrison and friends.